just a slightly deeper understanding of what the passions are, and then maybe a few words about anger in specific, which is often included in the list of passions. So, whenever you hear the words, even in secular terms, if you hear the words, even from a coworker or something, often something like the 7 deadly sins come up. You'll hear that. There was a movie called Seven that came out, and that was about the 7 deadly sins. So this is a concept that's known even outside of the Orthodox tradition, even in a secular sense. You'll see, and often these are the words that come up when you hear about the passions or the 7 deadly sins. So pride, anger, lust, so on and so forth that you see on the slide. Okay, so I guess the question is, we're gonna take a look at what exactly are these, and what is the role that this has in the spiritual life. So in any discussion regarding the passions, a good place to start is in the book of Genesis. We go back to the beginning because we need to understand, where we came from, how things began, to give us some context here. And so these verses are taken from the book of Genesis. Okay, so first of all, then God formed man out of the dust from the ground and breathed in his face the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And then the other verse that I wanted us to look at is, and then God saw everything he had made, and indeed it was very good. So I'm actually going to leave the first verse for now and focus more on the second one. Then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. Now, immediately we see a juxtaposition here, because if we look at the passions, these words, oftentimes there's a very negative connotation to all of these words, okay? And even in the phraseology of 7 deadly sins. So how do we square these two things with each other? If everything that God made was very good, and then especially, we can even look at anger in specific, what are the things that come to mind when we think of anger? We think of things like road rage or violence or abuse, things like that come to mind, even yelling, shouting, these kinds of things. How do we square the reality that we experience today with this verse from the Bible, divine revelation, stating that God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good? So the question is, what was God's divine intention, right? So when God created mankind, what was the purpose of creation? And to kind of summarize this point, we don't have time to go into detail, but we can summarize it in this way. Essentially, that one of the fundamental reasons that we were made is to be in perfect communion with God, with our neighbor, and with creation. Perfect communion, in other words, we can use as relationship, but even a more intimate, the most intimate relationship that we can think of. Okay, perfect communion. This was the intention that God had upon creating us. And we also affirm that God instilled within us the faculties to accomplish this in how he created us. And this is kind of getting at the first verse that I mentioned about the fact that we are both a body and a soul. We have a twofold creation. There's a twofold element to the way that we are created. We have a body which is visible, and we have a soul which is invisible. And the discussions about the soul tend to be a little bit more difficult because of the fact that it's unseen. We all have a good understanding, especially with the advancements of medical technology, about generally how the body works. We have a good understanding of sickness, disease, health, all these kinds of things related to the body. But how do we study the soul, right? When we talk about the soul, we need help. We need the guidance of things that have been revealed through us through the Holy Scriptures, and as well as the writings of the saints who have spent their entire lives devoted to prayer and the experience of battling with the passions, the experience of paying attention to their soul, and they're able to share with us certain things that we can then use for our benefit in the spiritual life. So just like the body has anatomy, there is anatomy of the soul as well, okay? And if you've never seen this before, if you read in some of the patristic writings and some of the earlier writings, you see a lot of these words come up, and the words, just for simplicity's sake, I've chosen reason, anger, and desire. If you read in some of the writings, sometimes they use the word insensitive, for anger and appetitive for desire, but we're just going to simplify this and just talk about reason, anger, and desire. And this comes from actually the Greek philosophical tradition. You know, the saints at that time, they used things that the people were familiar with. You know, Christ himself did this. You know, Christ spoke in parables. He used things like agriculture and other examples from nature or from the world around them to teach the people the deeper mysteries of the faith. And so the saints similarly used these kinds of teaching techniques to help us understand things that are unseen, such as the soul. So how does this work? So reason, I put reason on top for a second, on top for a reason, because reason is often one of the highest faculties in man. It's very closely tied to the idea of free will, that mankind is different from the beasts, for example, who we would say are irrational creatures, versus humankind, which are rational creatures. We have the use of reason. And then as far as anger and desire are concerned, you know, we're gonna go into it a little bit more detail, but St. Gregory of Nyssa tells us some of the reasoning that why we would have certain faculties within us, and that anger contributes to desire. I mean, anger contributes to virtue, sorry, and desire contributes to the love of God. Okay, and these elements within, or faculties within our soul, were God given to us, were given to us, you know, by God for a very good purpose. And of course, virtue and love of God go hand in hand. We can't pursue one without the other, and they're very intimately connected. Now, already we might see that this is a very bizarre thing to say that anger is, or the appetitive faculty is something that is included in the way that we were created. Okay, so immediately we already know that we're talking about something else here, something different from at least the manifestation of anger that we see in things like road rage or yelling and shouting. What the question we're asking here is, what was the actual intention, the divine intention behind this faculty of anger within our soul? And yeah, and I included that because mentioned, so what exactly are the virtues? Just as a few examples: humility, patience, chastity, so on and so forth. So the pursuit of these things. So what is the faculty of anger in the soul? So Saint John Climacus, who is one of the fathers of the church, he was a monk. He spent many years paying attention to his spiritual life, and he gives a very concise definition of anger. He writes, an easily changeable movement of one's disposition, an easily changeable movement of one's disposition. So this is something akin to maybe something like impulsiveness, right? And sometimes we think of impulsiveness has negative connotations to it. We can think of things like maybe in gambling, or you know, trying to buy something that last second at the grocery store when you're standing in line. You have a quick movement where you want to get something, right? But does it always have to only be negative, right? What about some of the positive uses of impulsiveness, like the desire to stand up for someone who's in trouble, or the desire to the movement to flee away from danger, right? Or something that is morally wrong. Saint Basil says that for temper is a sinew of the soul, producing vigor in it for the accomplishment of good actions. So sinew is a word similar to like tendon or ligament. So he's using even anatomical terminology to talk about this faculty within us, that it's the actual fundamental part of the soul that produces vigor, the ability to act quickly, but in a positive sense, for the accomplishment of good action. St. Basil also writes, when like a soldier who has placed his arms in the custody of his commander, it readily offers help in what is ordered. That anger can perhaps be an ally to reason against sin. So here we see a different intentionality, because what we're most familiar with is using the faculty of anger to inflict harm against our neighbor, to get vengeance as acts of violence, right? But we see here a divine intention that perhaps it can be an ally to reason against sin. And so going back to the way in this tripartite soul works together, you know, one of the metaphors that's given by St. Gregory is a charioteer with two horses, in which the person in holding the reins, the charioteer, is reason, and the two horses are anger and desire. One is anger, one is desire. And the idea is that when reason is in firm control of the reins, that the whole system can be directed properly towards God and towards virtue, right? And this was the divine intention within the soul that is a part of us. However, like we said, what we experience is not this. We don't always see this perfect use of anger towards virtue. We see things like I mentioned before, all of these misuses. And so this is often attributed to the consequences of the fall. So whenever you hear the fall, when we talk about Orthodox spirituality, it's referring to the events in Genesis in which Adam and Eve disobeyed the commandment of God and willingly separated themselves from God, again, through the use of their free will, right? And if we had to sum this up, I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but if we had to sum this up, that the conditions before the fall were those of perfect communion between man and God, neighbor and creation. And then after this willful disobedience and separation from God, we have the opposite. So we would say disharmony or disorder has now entered into creation, in which now we see for the first time division between man and God. You see Adam going to hide from God and blaming, you see blaming of one another. So we see division now enter into creation. And then the other parts of the aftermath, we can say that the effects or the natural consequences of this is also for the first time we see sickness, sin, and death enter into the world. And we have to make the distinction that it's these things aren't punishment per se, but rather the natural consequences. You see, it's like the same thing as, the natural consequences of touching fire would be to be burned, or the natural consequences of not eating would be to experience hunger. So these things weren't punishments per se, but the natural things that happen when we separate ourselves from life itself, right? Now things like death enter. And human nature as a whole is fallen. Okay, now here I use the word sin. Sometimes we see sin and passions used interchangeably. I'll explain a little bit more about different contexts in which sin and passion are used, but generally speaking also, when we use sin, we're not using it in kind of the Western use of, some kind of a morally wrong action, but the Orthodox understanding of sin is more so the breaking of relationship with God and missing the mark of perfection. We literally turn away from God and break relationship with God. So that our understanding of sin is a lot more relational and not so much about the breaking of rules. And so let's say we use the word passion instead. I think looking at the root of the word passion will help us understand a little bit more about the effects in mankind. So the root word of the word passions in the Greek is pathos, which is the same root as a word like pathology or pathologist, someone who studies disease. Or if you think of a pathology report at a hospital, it's the list of, if they've done a biopsy, the list of diseases that they found, right? So we have this linking of the word passions to disease. So I want you to remember that because it helps us understand also what the Orthodox understanding of sin and passions is as well. Again, not so much about rules, but rather a fundamental change that happens within us, something akin to disease, okay? And this goes back to the disorder that entered into the world through the fall. So, it's easier to understand this in, like I said, we have a twofold nature, both body and soul. We can think of looking at the body first. When the body is in perfect order, we call this health. Everyone knows, for the most part, what it is to be healthy. When we're not sick, that the systems of our body are functioning properly, circulatory system, the respiratory system, everything is in good health. When everything is in order. However, we've also experienced what it is like for the body to be in disorder when the systems of our body are not acting as they should. And keep in mind that these are the same systems that function normally, right? But when they're not acting as they should, then all of a sudden we experience what sickness is. Now we can kind of draw this metaphor to help understand what's happening in the soul as well. Saint Isaac the Syrian makes this connection for us. He writes, "If therefore virtue is the natural health of the soul, then the passions are an illness of the soul, which befalls and invades her nature and despoils her proper health." So, what are the consequences of the fall that happen within the soul? So, before the fall, we have reason and our use of free will as the dominant faculty, um, and anger and desire are supposed to be firm, and they were firmly in control. But then what happens after the fall is we have a change in this inclination. We have now a proclivity for a reason to take a back seat. And anger and desire now have a proclivity to, one way we can say this is maybe an inclination or a proclivity towards taking control, right? And so now there's this constant struggle. Now our free will wavers between, trying to have reason on top, but then sometimes failing. And there's times where we run away with desire. There's times where our anger gets the better of us. And this leads to all sorts of types of sins, right? Which can turn into passions. So let's see what the saints say about this fallen condition. Saint Basil writes, once reason has been pushed aside, the passion, and he's talking about anger here, but you could really apply this to other passions as well. But once reason has been pushed aside, the passion of anger takes control of the soul for itself. It makes the human being entirely like a wild beast. It does not allow him to be a human being since he no longer has the help of reason. So, we can think of this. So this is written a lot actually, is that, someone, losing their temper is often akin either to insanity or, a beast that has gone wild, or like a raging bull, or even drunkenness, these kinds of things of losing our senses essentially, or losing control of our reason. If you've ever seen someone lose their temper, we can akin it to someone who is, acting, irrationally, basically. And so this is what we see when reason takes a back seat. And then, one step further, it's not only losing control of reason, but like we mentioned in the fall, separating ourselves from God, right? So when man reveres God with all his heart and with faith, he receives through God's providence the power to control these faculties of anger and desire. However, when this doesn't happen and we misuse it, then we see that for it is desire and anger which are the cause of all evil. So we see that the same faculties that God has given for a good purpose, for the purpose of pursuing both God and virtue, and to be in harmony with our neighbor and creation, those become the very things or the means through which we actually sin through, or fall into these pitfalls. And so, another metaphor that you can think of here, it's kind of like the same way that something can be used either as a tool to accomplish some great task, or the same tool can be used as a weapon to harm someone instead, right? So this is how we understand that fundamentally, everything that God made was good, but rather it is through the use of our free will and now our inclination towards sin that we struggle, and we don't always use these God-given things for the divine intention that was initially intended. Okay, and we now more so find ourselves in this kind of a situation. Now we see that the passions and the virtues, we kind of bounce between these two things, that we are now in a state where we have to struggle. We have to struggle to acquire virtue, but the passions are not so easy to avoid at times. And so we see this juxtaposition now in the condition that we're in. So, well, going back to the slide. So now, at this point, we're drawing near to the close here. Hopefully we have a better understanding. I want to talk a little bit about now, when we use the word sin versus passion, we can go back to the metaphor of the health metaphor, right? And we can think of an example in which, let's say we sustain ourselves with some kind of an injury. Let's say we get a cut on the arm, okay? And initially, if we get a small cut, there's going to be some momentary damage, maybe some bleeding, some inflammation. But for the most part, if we do the necessary steps, like disinfect the wound and put a Band-Aid on, it should heal itself. Okay, and this we can liken to sin. Okay, but in a condition in which, let's say, we don't take care of the wound, right, and we allow it to fester, and and a number of things can happen from there, right? The cut can continue to get larger and open up more. It can get infected. It can get gangrene. We can get to the point where it can start to affect other systems of the body. And it could get really serious to the point where we have to actually amputate the arm. And some people are threatened with death, all from a simple cut. And this is kind of like an advanced stage, which we can think of as the passion. So one way in which the words sin and passions are differentiated from one another is that sin could be, anything. It could be even the initial misstep in which we miss the mark of perfection. But if we continue to make that same misstep over and over again, we kind of find ourselves deeper and deeper into some kind of addiction, something that takes control of our body and our soul, and often changes happen within the body chemically and things like that, and then it develops into a deep-rooted passion, which can be a lot more challenging to treat, to be able to take care of. And so that's just one clarification on the difference between a sin and passion in the way that it's sometimes used. Now, sticking with the health metaphor, I mean, there have been volumes written about all of the different passions and virtues that you see here. And to treat the passions, it's a very difficult thing. I mean, at the fundamental, I can't go into detail, about all of these, but, at the fundamental level, Christ is the great physician who is in charge of our care, who heals us. And the church is the hospital through which healing happens, you see, and there's many medicines, and each passion, just like every single disease, has its own signs and symptoms, has its own way to be diagnosed, has its own treatment. You can apply the same logic to the soul and how the soul is affected by the various passions. So, the treatment for anger is going to be different from the treatment of envy, even though there's going to be commonalities as well. So just keep that in mind, as we look at these different passions. So I'm just going to say maybe a brief word about anger, and then I'll close with a word about the passions in general. So, when we look at the treatment of anger, I've already mentioned that it's usually, when we see it referred to as a passion, what we're talking about is the misuse of anger, the use of anger against our neighbor, against God, against others. And we can think of anything from something like irritation leading all the way up to acts of violence, right? And these are the misuses of a faculty that is given to us by God, right? And so one of just in a very general sense, what the church teaches is, so there's a verse from Psalms, which is also quoted by St. Paul the Apostle, be angry, but do not sin. Be angry, but do not sin. So what is meant here? Okay, the church's understanding of what is meant here is we need to use anger in its proper context, in the way that it was meant to be used, right? And so it's more so not about completely shutting down anger, but rather redirecting the faculty of anger for the proper pursuit of virtue, okay? And just a few examples given to us, again, by the writings of the saints is as follows. So for example, rather than being angry with your neighbor, being angry, and having these different manifestations, it's more about directing anger. So for example, we can be angry with our own sins so as not to sin no more, okay? And I added the parentheses, do not despair, because it's a fine line. When we read the writings of the saints, we have to be really careful and understand the full context. To be angry with ourselves doesn't mean to be self-deprecating, to fall into despair and hopelessness. But you can think of something more like, if you think of like what separates maybe, like a professional athlete from, maybe a mediocre athlete, someone who, when they lose a game, takes it very seriously. They don't just take it lying down, right? So in a sense, they kind of get angry with themselves, they get frustrated with themselves, but for the purpose of learning, what they did wrong and using that power and that momentum to kind of to motivate themselves to do better, right? To change, and so that's the kind of that's the notion that's meant here, to be angry with your own sins. and definitely not angry with yourself, but rather, with the action, with the sin, and then definitely not to fall into despair. Another example is to be angry with Satan and no longer do his will, to refuse to do his will. Christ himself said, get behind me, Satan, to have, to put up no more with, Satan's lies and deceit, and to use the faculty of anger in that sense to turn away from Satan, and then another example is also to be angry at the various sins that are in the world, at the various injustices that exist. There's so many things that are not just in this world. And again, we have to be careful with how we use this, because this doesn't mean to then go forth and be, violent and things like that, but rather to be an agent of change, right? To be able to change these things. And the way that you do that is to always keep God before your eyes in your anger. So to be zealous, to want to change these things, and to always focus on wanting to never directing it at your neighbor, but rather always having compassion with the people who fall into the sins, but rather to try to be an agent of change, to try to reverse some of these injustices, but doing it in a loving way in which we keep God before our eyes. And then just a few more words about the passions in general. I really love this quote from St. Isaac. Be on your guard against small things, lest you fall in great matters. And this is kind of related to what I was saying about the difference between sin and passion, right? I mean, in the Orthodox tradition, we don't differentiate too much about small sins and big sins, because we treat that even any small sin can become a huge problem, right? And so we don't focus so much more on small versus big, but we treat every sin seriously, in the sense that we don't really want to say oh, it's no big deal, it was just one time, or it was just two times, or it was just in this context, kind of a thing, but rather if we maintain a lax attitude towards even the small things, that is the way that the evil one draws us into greater and greater sin. So this is just a fundamental principle of the spiritual life. And I think one of the quotes from one of the Shehimo prayers is something along the lines of, he who relaxes his guard slightly is drawn to the path of sin, something along those lines. So that, so I just wanted to share this quote, be on your guard against even the small things, because it is through the small things, the little frustrations in the day, that we can then grow more and more frustrated with certain things, with people in our lives, and it can turn into bigger problems and lead to damaged relationships over time, and we may not even notice it happen. So, and then the other quote, this is the final quote that I want to end with. It's I want it to be to have an element of like acknowledging that it's difficult. It's acknowledging that it's difficult. The church understands that, especially if we've already fallen into a passion, that it is a very difficult thing. If we haven't stopped it in the beginning, we find ourselves in need of treatment, and this is going to be things like Holy Confession, for example, in which the physician, as the priest, helps us find what are the things that we need to work on and things like that. But even the saints recognize that it takes much struggle and much labor, right? St. Joseph Hesychus says, you cannot obtain virtues through luxury and the easy life, but it takes struggle and much labor. It takes crying out to Christ day and night, and it takes patience in all temptations and afflictions. And so this is hopefully to encourage us to continue to be patient, no matter which of the passions that we're struggling with. Everyone struggles in different ways. The key is that when you fall, we all need to get up. We all have our different struggles, but the key is not to fall into despair when we fall. That we do have the church, we have Christ as our physician that offers us all the things that we need to receive treatment. The church teaches that really, as long as we're struggling, we are in the process of working out our salvation. Perfection, although perfection is the goal, we are encouraged to continue to struggle. And we struggle together as a community with one another. and we pray for one another through our struggles. And this is the loving approach of the church, that the church is a hospital for those who are struggling with these various illnesses. So hopefully, so this is the end of the talk. Hopefully you have a slightly deeper understanding of what the passions are, how they operate, and a little bit more about anger. And so thank you for spending some time with me, and I really appreciate it, Achin. Thank you for the opportunity. So have a good evening.